So, first of all, I just want to say that I'm going to be using my accordion sewn half square triangles technique for this. And if you're not familiar with that, I do have several YouTube videos that are right here on YouTube that you can check out and at least be familiar with the basic concept. This video is not going to teach you that. It's going to teach you how to use that method in order to make these outlined, what we're calling Flying Frankies, just for fun, because my phone auto-corrected to Frankies when I said flying geese, and I thought it was funny. So I'm just going to show you how I managed to get that piping in between where I need it to go based on what I want to do when I'm making my accordion sewn half square triangles. So I'm going to make a little different pattern than I have right here, just for simplicity's sake, because I have made this pattern a million times and I'll be able to whip together the accordion pretty easily. So what I'm going to need is some squares. What you're going to need is some squares. You can just cut a bunch of squares to practice this. And whatever background color you're going to want to use, you're going to need to have these fancy little strips, and you're going to need double the number of strips as you have background pieces. Okay, that's just, it's simple math. If you have 4 background pieces, you're going to need 8 little strips. Okay, now how did I make these strips? Well, number one, I dove very deep into my purple bin to see if I could find something really cool that would look good with these greens. And lo and behold, I had just a tiny little strip of this stuff. It was only 1 inch wide. And I was like, well, I have no idea why I kept that, but clearly it was for this, because you're going to cut those strips to 1 inch wide. And I actually cut them. They were much longer than this. They were more like with the fabric when I cut them. And then I folded them just like you're making a binding, just double them up, press them. And then I just went ahead and trimmed them all to just a little, just like if these are 3-inch squares, which these are, I'd probably make these about 5 inches. Okay. So that's your first step, to gather your squares and prepare your little, I don't know, shall we call it your piping? I don't know what we're going to call it. We're just going to call it our contrast piping. That sounds good. And then I will show you how it's done. I like to use this Clearly Perfect Angles tool. You can find it on my website if you like. It's by New Leaf Stitches. And it works really well for this method because I can just put the point of my square that I'm working with right on this outside, and I'm going to be able to sew a 1/4 inch perfectly. And that works really well for this method too, because what I'm going to want to do is take my first square, and then I'm always going to be putting these contrast pipings if I'm going to be either adding a background or I already have a background down here. So I know that my next square is going to be a background. So therefore I'm going to put my piping in. So in order to do that, all I do is line up my piping with the folded edge to the right, the open edge right on that diagonal. And here's where regularly I don't really recommend pinning when we do accordion sewing, but for this one, if you want to keep it kind of straight, it's probably not a bad idea. Okay, and then I'm going to take my next square and place it right over, and because we can't really see that point up here, let me show you, that point up here quite as well, we kind of have to really use the outside corners to line it up, if that makes sense. Okay. And I kind of just make sure that you do want to make sure that those two things are lined up, the point with the edge right there and the point with the edge right here. So sometimes it takes a little finagling. This isn't quite as straightforward as the regular accordioning, in case you haven't noticed. The regular accordioning, I came up with in 10 minutes. This one took me a couple days. Okay, so then I'm just going to sew this just like I would if I was accordion sewing. I'm just going to sew a 1/4 inch from the right of the diagonal. And then I have my scissors here because I'm taking it out. I kind of did a little wavy, but you should see my setup here. I can barely reach my foot pedal the way I have this set up currently. So I'm going to call it a win that I did okay. All right. And then I'm going to open it up. I'm going to see the raw edges of my piping. That's okay. Okay. That is okay. Because again, your actual half square triangle is in here. All right. So if you open it up and you see raw edges, don't panic. That's what you want. Again, we're going to push all of that stuff over there. And I find it easiest once I get that first one on to push the raw edge over to the right, because that way with this next one that I'm going to line up, because I have another side of this background, right? So I'm going to put my next one and line it up so that they're basically right next to each other. And again, if I want to do a pin, you won't be surprised if you know me that I don't always pin, because, you know, that's pinning is for people that are, you know, just not quite as okay with imperfection as I am. All right. But for purposes of this, I'm just showing you how I would pin. All right. And again, see how it's a little crowded there. So you do kind of have to just line up that outside point. That's going to be your most important thing. Make sure these 2 points are pretty parallel, and make sure your point here and the raw edge of your piping are right there where you're about to, right at this outside line here, so that when you sew, you've got your 1/4 inch to the right of the diagonal again. It takes a little more practice, people. Don't be discouraged. Okay, so now I'm going to open it up again. Whoops, probably take out my pin first. Open it up, push these guys over to the left. All right, and now my next one that I need for this particular order that I'm making is not going to be, or is going to be a print, or excuse me, another print. So I don't need another piping quite yet, because I know that this is going to be 2 prints together. So I'm just going to stick that on there. And I'm going to sew again. This is a little bit easier to see without that piping in there. So it's going to be maybe a little bit straighter, but that's good. That's why we overcut, so that we can trim them down. Okay, and now my next one, again, is going to be a background. So I'm going to take again, and I'm going to line up, and I'm going to pin. So anytime I'm putting a background on, because that's what I'm outlining, I'm going to have to make sure that I have a piping on there. Okay, sew down that 1/4 inch. Take out my pin, open it up, push it over. And because this is a background, again, we want to make sure that we have another little piping. This one got cut a little bit short, but that's okay. When it trims, it'll be fine. Oh, and then I need to put my next print on there. Let's see, I'm going to move it down a bit. So it's a little bit fussier for sure. Maybe a little bit more thinking, and you all know how I feel about thinking. I don't like to have to think too hard, but you know, we have to suffer in order to make something gorgeous. So here I am thinking. Okay, and then because I'm going to put another one that is not a background on here, I wouldn't need my piping in there. So I've got my wonderful little accordion all done and all tubed up. It's a little bit harder to stand these guys up because they've got those pipings in there, but it can still be done if you're really careful. So, you know, I know a lot of you like to stand them up. So there you go, and take a photo or something, because it is really cute. Anyway, the cutting apart, same idea. I just wanted to show you about the slicing the tube open because it's a little bit, there's something new in there. There's still the same process, but there's new fabric in there and people might panic. So you can cut it down. Again, any of the diagonals, like my print ones, don't necessarily have the piping in there. So they might be the ones that I would choose to cut down just to, not have that extra layer of the purple fabric. But if you have done an accordion that happens to have piping in between each one, like if you were just going back and forth between a background and a print, you would have piping pretty much everywhere. All you're going to do again is don't worry so much about the piping because in between here, that's just raw edge and you're not going to see it anyway. So if you catch it a little bit, that's all right. You're just going to slice right down the diagonal of the square. And then boom, it opens up. And again, you're going to see all of these little raw edges of your piping are going to be showing in between your background pieces because that's where we were putting them, right? So in order to cut them apart, again, we're just going to turn it over, push them all to the right or to the left side, depending on whether you are right-handed or left-handed. And again, I go over all of this in my 3-part series on how to accordion, but it's no different here. Again, you've just got raw edges of those purple strips underneath. Doesn't matter if you cut a teeny bit of them off. You're just going to slice right down the diagonal of each of these guys, opening it up. Because you've got that extra bulk, they might not want to lay flat quite as easily, so just be careful as you go. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about pressing these guys. I am a very unapologetic open presser. Those of you who have taken classes with me or been sitting next to me when I'm sewing, you know that I absolutely am a believer that open pressing is always the way to go. And these guys have decided to prove me wrong because in order to get the look that you're going for with the outlining, these guys are often going to form a flying goose, right? That's the Flying Frankie we're talking about. So in order to get it so that you're going to have that point showing, you need to think about what direction you're having your flying goose, or what fabrics are going to create the goose and what fabrics are going to create the outside. So you're going to want to press your piping toward the fabric that's going to be, shall we say, the body of the goose. So when I did this one here that you've seen, I pressed toward the prints so that I would get this nice little seam allowance, basically, when I put them together, made up of my background. That's if I want my flying goose to be the print. Now, if I want my flying goose to actually be made of the background, which I do this time, I'm going to want to press my piping toward the background. So in order to do that, all I do is open up the opposite type of fabric and press out so that my piping ends up going toward the fabric that I want my goose to be made of. Hopefully that makes sense. It's kind of a trial and error. Again, I did a lot of trial and error with coming up with this method, and that's just how it works for me. You may find something else might work a little bit better for you. So I just wanted to mention it. And once you get everything trimmed and pressed and sewn together, this kind of thing is what you're going to end up with. So once again, basically I think of them as kind of like flying geese. Decide to press my piping toward the flying goose, and it ends up sort of outlining whatever shape you're doing. So I hope you found this interesting, maybe a little bit entertaining, maybe something you might want to try. Please visit my website at evapagequilts.com for all of my books and patterns that involve the accordion sewn half square triangle technique. Also, please remember that this is a trademark technique, and writing down and distributing directions on how it's done is prohibited. Thank you very much for supporting my business and respecting designers. Have fun.